What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my friends. I'm Henry Kuto, your host, and thank you so much for joining us this week for a little piece of Halloween. Except it's March. But I'm not going to let that stop me, and you shouldn't let it either. And before we get to the story, I do want to say, and I wouldn't usually talk about this at the opening of the show, but we're all trying our best to handle the coronavirus situation. I personally am participating heavily in social distancing, and a lot of people have been hit in a lot of ways, especially economically. And I don't believe that my situation is at all special, but I had to cancel, it wasn't really my choice, but we had many events canceled and jobs canceled that have kind of affected my living. So if you really enjoy this podcast, if you enjoy the podcast I put out, please head over to weeklyspooky.com. There are three ways you can support us. You could buy a piece of merchandise. You can join our Patreon, which is an awesome place to hang out and get the scary episodes as soon as they're available. Or we have a tip jar where you can make a one-time contribution. I would really very much appreciate it. I am dealing with a little bit of financial hardship to come very soon, and I want to be ahead of it and ready, but also I want to be able to isolate myself socially with you guys and tell you some scary stories. And speaking of which, we have a great piece of scary story escapism for you guys tonight, written by my good friend Scott S. Phillips. I'll talk a little bit more about him, the author, in a little bit after the story, and also you can find more information about him in the show notes. But what is better escapism than horror? Oh, I'll tell you what is. Western horror. That's right, a first on Weekly Spooky. We are going to the Old West with tonight's story, so I say, why waste any more time? Let's wash our hands and let's start the story.
Basket Hound by Scott S. Phillips.
Oral Hamlin stared up at the night sky, wondering if the flying monkey would ever come back. This was his favorite part of the day, round about 2 a.m. when it came time to empty the spittoons. They reeked, of course, from the rotten-toothed spit of 100 cowboys and cheap chewing tobacco. On occasion, a drunk would piss in one rather than stagger out back to the outhouse, and the stink got a hell of a lot worse when someone had puked in one of them. But even that Oral could live with, because being the designated dumper of spittoons meant he got to go outside by himself. Mr. Tevens didn't much let Oral go outside on his own otherwise, day or night. Oral carried a lantern in one hand and a spittoon in the other. It was black as hell out there, and he didn't want to fall in that trench again. Some nights, when the moon was real bright, he didn't need the lantern, but bringing it meant he had to make 4 trips to empty the spittoons, and he was happy for every one of them. Early on, right after Oral was given the task as a responsibility Mr. Tevens felt he could handle, the saloon's bartender, a one-eyed, crotchety son of a bitch named Branlin, insisted he dump all the spittoons into a big bucket and carry that out, 1 trip, easy and done. Oral consistently made a point of spilling the contents of the spittoons while dumping them into the bucket, and Branlin eventually gave up on the idea. Oral suspected Mr. Tevens had caught on to his scheme, but the older man never mentioned it. When it came time to dump the chamber pots from upstairs, though, Oral didn't bring the lantern. He didn't much enjoy taking the chamber pots out, and with one in each of the upstairs rooms, except for Mr. Tevens' office, Oral wanted it over with as quickly as possible. Oral was 17 years old and had been with Mr. Tevens since he was 8, when Oral's daddy beat him senseless, and he pretty much stuck that way. It was just after the war, and Mr. Tevens had come west minus a leg, but full of big dreams, looking to make his fortune in the liquor and whore trade. He was literally stepping off the train when he saw Oral trip and fall in the mud, doing great disservice to his best clothes, but nothing to incur the sort of whipping his daddy unleashed as a result. Mr. Tevens hop-stepped on his wooden leg into the middle of the dust-up and threw a beating on Oral's daddy that left the man with a limp of his own, not to mention a busted-up face that would ensure he'd remember what he'd done every time he looked in the mirror till the day he died. The beating also did wonders for Mr. Tevens' standing in the town, since no one much liked Oral's daddy and felt it was a long time coming. Tevens had purchased the stone house, which Oral thought was funny since the place was made out of wood, the larger of the town's 2 saloons, and the only one that came equipped with prostitutes and Branlin. Tevens moved into one of the upstairs rooms, and when Oral wandered into the joint a few days later, his daddy having run off in the night, Tevens took him in. Oral's room was basically a closet at the end of the hall with a cot in it, but he lived there happily ever since. "What you gazing at, kid?" Oral jumped, slopping some of the spittoon's contents onto the ground. Standing a dozen or so yards away was a man, watching him. Oral raised the lantern, trying to get a better look, but the light refused to cooperate, as if it were sliding off the figure. "Who's that there?" Oral asked, voice unsteady. "Ain't scared, are ya?" "No," Oral lied. After a moment, the man walked towards Oral. When he was a few feet away, the light from the lantern took hold, illuminating his features. Whip-thin, about 5.5 feet tall. Oral was relieved to see the man was shorter than him, clad in dusty gray trousers, stained shirt with frilled cuffs, and a black leather vest. His bowler hat was tilted far back on his head, like he was walking away from it, and it was struggling to keep up. Unlike the rest of his clothing, his boots were new, but covered in dust. His eyes were close together, deep-set, and focused on Oral in a way that made him uncomfortable, like he was in trouble for something. The man's lips pulled back in a smile that bunched up the weathered skin on the sides of his face like a wash rag being wrung out. "Name's Malcolm. George Malcolm." Malcolm George Malcolm, Oral thought. First name same as the last. No, that ain't right. He just said it funny is all. George Malcolm. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Malcolm." Oral went to stick out a hand, realized they were both full, then settled on a nod towards the man. "My name's Hamlin. Oral Hamlin." "Why you out here in the night with a cuspidor full of Christ knows what, son?" "Just spit and chew is all," Oral said, taking a quick look to be sure. "It's my job. One of 'em." Malcolm cocked an eye at Oral. "You some kinda simpleton?" "No, sir. Took an injury as a boy, somewhat scrambled my brains." "You sound like a simpleton." Oral frowned. "No, sir." Setting the lantern down on the ground, he upended the spittoon over the trench he'd dug a few days prior, the foul-smelling stew of saliva and tobacco, and, as Malcolm pointed out, Christ knows what, spattered into the thicker sludge in the bottom of the trench. "I have a job, and I do okay for myself, I reckon." He straightened, fixing Malcolm with a stern gaze. "Didn't mean no offense, son. This job of yours, I'm guessing it's in a saloon or some other joint serves liquor?" "Yes, sir. The Stone House. Not 100 paces from where we stand now." "Mind if I walk with you?" Oral puzzled on it for a moment. "Again, I meant no offense," Malcolm said, bowing slightly, "and I could sure stand to pour some whiskey into myself." "No, it ain't that," Oral said. "Just that Branlin's closing up the bar about now. I don't think he'd turn away your business, though." Malcolm made a sweeping gesture toward the nearby buildings. "Then if you're finished pouring out your slop, by all means lead the way, son." Oral started back to the stone house, Malcolm falling into step next to him. After a few paces, Oral glanced at the man, catching the tail end of an odd expression that sent something wriggling up Oral's spine to settle coldly at the base of his skull. The only time he'd felt anything similar was when his daddy was about to go on a tear. "Ain't my place to pry, what with us having just met and all, Mr. Malcolm, but I was wondering why you'd be out walking in the desert late at night like this." Malcolm took so long to answer, Oral thought he hadn't heard the question and was about to ask again when the man finally spoke. "Guess I got lost just a little bit. Was on my way from Bell's Creek." Oral wanted to press him further, but they'd reached the back door of the stone house, and Malcolm took the opportunity to steer things in a different direction. "How many in there, son? Yourself included?" Oral hung the lantern on a hook near the back door. "Just a few. Plus the whores, and some or all of 'em might be with customers. He made to open the door, but Malcolm's hand darted out, grabbing the handle. You know that ain't no real answer, don't you, boy? Malcolm said, making another of his fancy gestures as he opened the door to allow Oral in. Oral gave Malcolm a confused look as he stepped past him, entering a narrow, dark hallway. Lamplight from the saloon's main room spilled in at the other end. There's the 3 of us plus 4 whores and whatever men they's with, Oral said. We got 2 girls wait tables, but they gone home a while ago. Malcolm stepped into the hall, closing the door behind him. Fine, let's have that drink. Oral led the way down the hall into the main room of the saloon, its dozen or so tables empty at this late hour. To their right was a staircase to the upper floor. On the left was the bar, an L-shaped counter with wooden stools running the length of it. Liquor bottles topped the shelves behind the bar, and a carefully lettered sign read, Tabs for liquor only, not whores. Branlin, looking 600 years old but meaner than hell, a puckered scar where his left eye had been, wiped the bar with a towel that looked as unpleasant as he did. His gray hair hung stringy past his shoulders, and his cheeks, trenched with age, were covered in salt and pepper stubble. His single eye settled on Oral and Malcolm, and he stopped wiping to stare at them. What's this you brung in? Branlin said. Found him out back, Oral said. He was hoping he could get a drink. Or 2, Malcolm said, stepping up to the bar and proffering a hand. Malcolm. George Malcolm. He done it again, Oral thought. Branlin's eye looked at the hand, then at Malcolm's face. He wiped his hand right with the bar towel and shook with him. Well, Mr. Malcolm, technically we's closed for business, but I think we can accommodate you, if you got money, of course. A pocketful, Malcolm said, stepping up and resting his elbows on the bar. Whiskey, please. Don't care how cheap or how shitty. We don't serve shitty whiskey in this joint. Malcolm turned his head to find Mr. Tevens coming down the stairs, stepping with his good leg, then swinging the wooden one after. With the saloon closed, he'd taken off the jacket, but still wore the rest of his favorite white suit, the vest unbuttoned. Tevens was about 35, probably handsome if you gave him half a chance, black hair slicked back and long sideburns neatly trimmed. That's what I like to hear, Malcolm said, removing his hat and setting it on the bar. Oral set the spittoon down in its place at the end of the bar and started for the next one, midway along, not far from where Malcolm was leaning. Branlin poured a shot of whiskey and pushed it toward Malcolm as Tevens reached the bottom of the stairs. Malcolm lifted the glass. Lose that leg in the war? Infection took it, Tevens said. Injury itself weren't too bad. Malcolm raised the glass, as if to toast. Ain't you a fine trio? Short a leg, an eye, and a brain. He knocked back the shot, swallowing hard. Ain't polite to make light of those showing you hospitality after hours, Tevens said. Apologies, Malcolm banged the glass down on the bar and looked at Branlin. How about another of those? Branlin looked past him at Tevens, who nodded. Branlin filled the glass. So what's your story, Mr. Malcolm? Like I was telling your chambermaid here, I got lost on my way from Bell's Creek. Walkin', Oral said. And I ain't a chambermaid. He picked up the spittoon, careful to get a good grip, as it was always the fullest being in the middle of the bar. You walked from Bell's Creek? Tevens asked. That's a good 20 miles, ain't it? Took me a good while. Malcolm swigged the second shot of whiskey, smacked his lips. Sounds like a load of old bullshit to me, Branlin said. Malcolm slowly rolled the shot glass back and forth between thumb and forefinger, watching the tiny bit of liquid left there is to slide around the inside. I think, he said, pausing to tip his head way back and throw that last drop down his throat, we've gotten off on the wrong foot here, fellas. He gently set the glass on the bar, his eyes locked on Branlin's single peeper, then casually slid it towards him, nodding for a refill. Oral tensed, fearing trouble. The cranky bartender was not one to be trifled with, something he'd learned a long time ago. Mr. Tevens gestured to Branlin to fill the glass. I think what my bartender is getting at, Mr. Malcolm, is how you come to be lost in the desert for what must have been a long, hot stretch, and first thing you ask for is whiskey, not water. You got a rule or something? Thirsty man must drink water? Malcolm twisted, looking around the room. "'Cause I don't see a sign." "Just odds all," Teven said. Malcolm turned back to the bar and picked up the refilled shot glass. With an eye on Teven's, he knocked it back and set the glass down again. "Hits the spot just fine." Oral could see the desire to give Malcolm George Malcolm the bum's rush burning in Mr. Teven's eyes. First thing he'd have to do once this all settled out was apologize for bringing the stranger into the saloon. Meanwhile, he still had 3 spittoons needed emptying, but he wasn't sure he should leave, just in case there was some kind of fight and Mr. Tevens and Brandlin needed him. This situation was his fault, after all. "You staying long, Mr. Malcolm?" Tevens asked. Off Malcolm's expression, he added, "In town, I mean." "Haven't made up my mind yet," Malcolm said. "Don't exactly seem like the most hospitable place." He gestured to Brandlin to pour another shot. "Have to see how I feel after my business is concluded." "And what business might that be? Maybe I can aid you in your endeavors," Teven said. "As you might imagine, a man in my line of work is fairly well connected." "Anything to hasten me on my journey, I suppose," Malcolm said. He lifted the shot glass, this time sipping the whiskey. Showing Tevens he wasn't in a hurry, Oral thought. Brandlin used the tone of voice he fell into when it was near time to eject a troublemaker. Spoke up again. "Sip away, friend. Bar's closing and that's your last drink." Malcolm eyed the bartender for a moment, then gently set the glass down. "My business," Malcolm said, "is sales." He tucked a hand inside his vest, freezing when Brandlin reached beneath the bar, coming up with the Colt Banker's Special, the barrel leveled at Malcolm's chest. Malcolm's gaze flicked from the Colt to Brandlin's single eye. "Did I mention the word inhospitable recently?" He kept his hand inside his vest, unmoving. Oral took a cautious step away from the bar, positioning himself out of the line of fire. Or so he hoped, if things went further south. "Let's not get carried away here, boys," Mr. Tevens said. His hand had instinctively moved for his own gun, only to find it gone. Upstairs on his desk, still in the holster. "Why don't you finish that drink, Mr. Malcolm, and then be on your way so we can close up for the night?" Malcolm kept his eyes on Brandlin's. "I believe that sounds acceptable. If it's all right with everyone, I'd like to slowly extract my hand. There will be something in it, but I assure you now, it's not a gun or knife." "You just be damn sure it happens slow," Brandlin said. Malcolm took his time pulling his hand from his vest. There was indeed something held in it. "You were curious about my business," Malcolm said, smiling. He opened his hand. In the palm lay a short, cylindrical object, hollow, about 4 inches long and 1 inch in diameter, blotchy yellowish-white in color, with dark streaks running along its length. One end was notched around the circumference, creating a ring of sharpened teeth. Oral, Tevens, and Brandlin all took a hesitant step or two closer to get a better look. "What is it?" Oral asked, on tiptoe now, leaning forward, not wanting to get too close to the stranger, but curious as hell about the object he held. "Tool of my trade," Malcolm said. "Some kinda carved bone or something?" Tevens asked. Brandlin, his gun still pointed at Malcolm but nearly forgotten, squinted his single eye and peered at the object. "I got no idea what that is. You sell these dingwhoppers?" "No," Malcolm said. "I sell what comes out of it." Malcolm sprang up like some kind of monster insect, boots slamming onto the bar and grabbing a handful of Brandlin's hair as the bartender's gun went off. Oral saw a spurt of gore as the bullet punched through Malcolm's back and continued up into the ceiling. Someone on the second floor screamed. Unfazed by the gunshot wound, Malcolm grinned down at Brandlin from his perch on the bar and viciously jammed the mysterious object into Brandlin's throat. The bartender gurgled, staggering back, and Malcolm casually plucked the gun from his hand. "Son of a bitch!" Tevens rushed at Malcolm. "Hey now," Malcolm said, not looking at Tevens but swinging the pistol around to stop him in his tracks. "Let's see what happens. What do you say?" Choking, Brandlin clutched at the object protruding from his throat. A small amount of blood trickled through the opening, but surprisingly little, considering the wound. Oral heard doors opening upstairs, shuffling footsteps as people reacted to the gunshot and the yelling. A couple of the braver whores appeared at the top of the stairs, along with one of the tricks. None of them seemed inclined to intervene. "Here we go," Malcolm said. He spun atop the bar and plopped down on his ass, facing Oral and Tevens. Keeping the gun on them, he used his other hand to deftly unbutton his shirt about halfway down, revealing a circular black disc about 3 inches across embedded in the center of his chest. The flesh puckered around it. At the edge of the disc was a tiny knob, like the winding stem of a pocket watch. Malcolm delicately twisted the knob, and the center of the disc irised open. Oral thought he could hear anguished whispers from within Malcolm's chest. Branlin let out a soft moan as he toppled forward, catching himself on the bar. He looked to Mr. Tevens, desperate, as a pale bluish mist began to seep from the end of the tube jammed into his neck. The mist swirled up and around Malcolm, then snaked its way into the hole in Malcolm's chest. That's the stuff," Malcolm muttered, as the cloud of mist continued to pour from Branlin's body and wind its way into Malcolm's. Branlin's face grew ashen and withered, the skin sinking in to cling to his skull. His good eye bulged from the socket, pushing past the shriveled eyelids. Oral and Tevens stared on in horror, accompanied by a slightly comical sputtering. The last of the mist dribbled from the tube in Branlin's neck and whirled around Malcolm, to disappear within him. Branlin's body collapsed to the floor with a sound like a sack of dry leaves. There was silence for a moment. Then Malcolm hopped down from the bar. "Ain't that about the craziest thing you ever did see?" "What in God's name did you do to him?" Tevens hollered. "What was that? That smoke, what came out of him?" "That, my friend," Malcolm said, giving another of his little theatrical flourishes, "was your bartender's tainted soul." Tevens sucked in a deep breath, the air whistling through his clenched teeth. "Then you some kind of devil, then?" "No, sir, not at all. I'm as human as either of you standing here." Malcolm sat down on a bar stool again. "What I am is more of a broker." Tevens nodded towards the bloody bullet wound in Malcolm's chest. "That gunshot didn't even faze you. What kind of human is that?" "Funny, ain't it?" Malcolm glanced at the bullet hole. "Second time I've been shot with no real ill effect. Stings a little, I must admit, but hell, gunshot like that, I ought to be laying here toes up. Seems to be something about having souls stored up in me. I got a couple others in there before I sucked up your buddy. Couple of folks I run into on my way here from Bell's Creek." Malcolm snatched up the bottle of whiskey from the bar. "I can tell you, though, I've been shot when it wasn't so pleasant." He took a swig, put the bottle down, and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. "No, sir, I ain't no devil, but I seen plenty of 'em out there." "You sell 'em the souls you take," Oral said. Malcolm smiled at him. "I must say, the simpleton keeps surprising me." Oral scowled, wanting to say something, but nervous about the gun in Malcolm's hand. "How'd you come to be in this particular line of work?" Tevens asked. "Well, now, that's a tale," Malcolm said, "but I'll see if I can give you the short version. Towards the end of the war, I run into this old darky, a voodoo woman, she called herself. I didn't believe her at first, but I done a little something pissed her off, and next thing I know, I'm stumbling around like a drunkard. Only I ain't imbibed none. I passed out, and when I come around, I got this thing in my chest. Little old darky woman tells me she put a curse on me for what I done. She was the first one down my new soul gullet. Weren't long I start running into those devils I spoke of. Turns out most of 'em are in the market for an easy soul or two. Was the war brought 'em, you know." Oral didn't like the idea of devils wandering around freely, and more than that, he didn't like the idea of Malcolm going any damn place with Branlin's soul inside of him. He looked at Mr. Tevens. "I'm sorry I brung this fella in, sir." "It's all right, Oral," Mr. Tevens said. "Hell yeah, it is," Malcolm said. "You was just being a good Christian soul." He grinned again. "And speaking of which, I expect the soul of a man owns a whorehouse that's probably a dime a dozen, not to mention his whores." Oral shivered as Malcolm turned his gaze upon him, looking him up and down. "But a fella like this'n? Well, he might fetch a decent price." The moans from within the hole in Malcolm's chest rose in pitch, as if the souls locked away in there were excited about having the company. Mr. Tevens sneered at Malcolm. "They's any kind of human left in you, you'd let him go. He's just a kid." Malcolm slowly shook his head. I'm afraid I can't do that. I've got a business to run, after all. Oral struggled to keep the fear from showing on his face. I've seen crazier, he said. What now? The thing you did, taking Brandlin's soul like that? You asked us if it was the craziest thing we ever seen. I'm telling you, I seen crazier. Malcolm looked at Mr. Tevens amused. He gestured towards Oral with the gun. Listen, I tell you, to Oral he said, all right, son, what in this great big world of ours could you possibly have seen that's crazier than what you witnessed moments ago? Oral gripped the edge of the spittoon, felt the thick, foul-smelling liquid inside the slop against his fingertips. Seen a flying monkey once. Malcolm stared at him for a long moment, his mouth opened slightly. Out back here, Oral said, where me and you met. A flying monkey? Malcolm said. Not flying like a bird, floating kinda like a leaf on a breeze, and glowing. Oral shot a nervous glance at Mr. Tevens, worried that the older man would think he was out of his full mind. It was a little maybe half my size, didn't have no hair like a usual monkey, just kinda pinkish skin all over, came floating up out of the desert, looking at me and kinda smiling like it wanted to be friendly. Oral's eyes narrowed. Not a phony, mean smile like you've got. Malcolm's amused expression faded. So you and this floatin' and glowin' monkey became the best of pals, I take it. And where's your pink little buddy now? Maybe upstairs with one of the whores? Oral hadn't felt this way since before his daddy run off. He didn't care for it, not one bit. He floated away after a few minutes. I ain't seen him since. Now what kind of a friend is that? Malcolm slid off his bar stool and walked over to Oral. Sounds like you might have got into the liquor that night, boy. Or maybe you just dreamed the whole damn thing. No, sir, Oral said. This was a couple months back. I ain't told no one. I was out late, had to take Johnson out. That's my dog, Johnson. He's a basket hound. He's real old and don't get around so well. A basket hound? Malcolm shouted. God damn, you are a simpleton, son. Basket hound. He shook his head, laughing. It's Bassett. Oral swung the spittoon as hard as he could into the side of Malcolm's head. Stunned, Malcolm dropped the pistol and stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. He fell, the back of his head thudding on the wooden floor. Oral's foot came down on his throat, grinding down into his windpipe. Malcolm let out a strangled gasp. Oral leaned over the man and started pouring the muck from the spittoon into the opening in his chest. Even with a foot on his throat, Malcolm managed to shriek in pain as the viscous crud slopped into him. He tried to get his hand up, turn the knob to shut the opening, but Oral knocked it away. Twisting in agony, Malcolm's gaze fell upon a skinny, ancient dog laying in a basket under the stairs, head lifted, watching Malcolm incuriously. Oral lifted his foot from Malcolm's throat. Wheezing, Malcolm tried to wriggle away as Tevens loomed over him. A large knife. Or maybe it was a short sword, hard to tell, his vision blurred the way it was, in his hand. Tevens swung the blade. It took 2 tries to separate Malcolm's head from his body. It rolled to one side, Malcolm's dying eyes falling once again on the dog beneath the stairs. Johnson lowered his head to the edge of the basket, still watching, disinterested, as Malcolm's eyes fluttered, then closed. Oral poured the rest of the slop into Malcolm's chest until the opening overflowed, then stepped away from the lifeless body, breathing hard, not taking his eyes off the corpse. I have a job, and I do okay for myself, Oral said. Now that is an ending. Don't underestimate young Oral. He's been through hell and back. Not literally like the antagonist, but you should never underestimate somebody like that. He's strong. And you fucked with the wrong guy, weird, out-of-town, soul-stealing rat bastard. I really enjoyed that one. Thank you to Scott S. Phillips for contributing it to the show. If you'd like to find out more about his work as an author, please give him a search on Amazon or check out the show notes. There'll be a link to his author page. He's best known for the Pete Drinker of Blood series of books, and they are really, really fun. He has a great writing style. I hope we have even more short pieces from him in the near future. I love that really the antagonist's undoing was his desire to belittle someone he thought was mentally inferior. That's what took him down. Beautifully done. Mwah. Love that. So anyway, I hope everybody listening to this is doing well. I hope that you are washing your hands and not touching your face. I personally would recommend, some relative social distancing, but, that's got to be up to you, what you're going to do. It's been a wild time. I'm 33 years old. I haven't seen everything by any stretch, but I really have never seen anything like this, ever. It's a little bit of a bummer, I've lost some work that was really important, and I don't want to keep harping on like that, but if you go to weeklyspooky.com and you want to support the show at all, please consider it. Speaking of which, I want to thank our podcast boosters, Kevin Fry, Jack Kerr, Jason Limberg, Karen Wiemet, Nicholas Dawson, and Craig Cohen for supporting the show directly, and also a big thank you to our producer, Dan Wilder, who just had his twin babies, and everybody's doing really well over there. So if you're listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe, share, all the stuff you expect to be told to do. Please subscribe on iTunes if you're listening to this. I've been having a great time. This is the 21st episode of Weekly Spooky, and I have no intention of stopping, unless, of course, I get a very pernicious dry cough. So anyway, until next time, talk at you later.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you're safe. Trust me.